So we're recording a couple of days late this week.
Sorry about that, but we're here.
Life happens. Actually, what we really wanted to do was record a history podcast the morning of the Super Bowl.
Yeah, that's what we wanted to do. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Are we allowed to say the word Super Bowl? I know the NFL sues the hell out of people who use it, who don't pay them.
Oh, really? So they're like Disney.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize that. Now we've said two words that we're not allowed to say. So.
Super Bowl and Disney.
Yes.
Yeah. The Super Bowl.
I just figured out how to stream it. I'm not really a football watcher, but I am a food eater. So I figured I should at least have the game on as I consume the.
What's on the menu? What's the highlight of the menu?
Well, the kids have been really, really wanting hot dogs. And like, we don't really eat a lot of bread around here. So we got like hot dogs, hot dog buns. We're doing baked beans, baked mac and cheese, tons of different dips, guacamole, spinach, bean dip, all different types of chips. So it's not like insane. Oh, and then we're doing hot wings, of course.
Okay. Are you doing those disgusting countertop nachos that everybody on Instagram?
I'm so grossed out by the countertop nachos. What? And especially during COVID, right? Where I'm like, no.
Yes.
No.
And it gets, the worst part of it is when they pour the melted nacho cheese all over it.
Absolutely disgusting. And you think I'm offended because I'm like, that's not enough cheese. Like the table's too big. And you don't have enough cheese to coat every chip. Like it's purely performative, it's not good. It's just a performance. It's a chip performance. And I'm not about it. I love nachos, but no, that grosses me out.
I love nachos, but I look at it and I'm like, how many people are you feeding nachos to?
Yeah. Well, and how many people are you feeding nachos to incorrectly? You have not put enough toppings on any of these things. You just like kind of haphazardly fling some toppings around. I'm very offended by it.
I have Totino's in the freezer.
Are you doing something for the Super Bowl? You're doing pizza rolls?
I am cooking some Totino's pizza rolls. It's a Saturday Night Live thing. They parody Totino's on it, and it just cracks me up. It's kind of like the peach candle I send you for Christmas.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I really like Totino's pizza rolls, so.
Yeah, Totino's pizza rolls. I think I have Totino's pizza rolls, bagel bites.
Ooh.
Just horrible stuff for me. Really bad.
Yeah. I love
I do have stuff for nachos. I have stuff for nachos.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good.
And I think I had one other thing. Oh, I've got taquitos with guacamole.
I hope all of this is going in an air fryer.
Almost all of it. It's certainly not going on a countertop.
That's how it's done.
All right. Well, today we're going to be talking about kind of the early history of African Americans. Kind of Black history, as the title of the episode goes. Black history to 1776. We kind of decided we wanted to do 4 special episodes during February Black History Month, kind of really focusing on kind of broad contours of the Black experience in America, but also bring up some kind of historical controversies and kind of issues. Consider it kind of I'm approaching it kind of like a little mini course, right? A little 4-part mini course.
Yeah, 4-part mini course, which we'll be able to use in our courses for years to come. So
yeah,
cool.
Yeah. So, well, let's get right into it. Welcome to An Incomplete History.
I'm Hillary.
And I'm Jeff.
And we're your hosts for this weekly history podcast.
So, what's the weather like for Super Bowl Sunday in Oxford, Mississippi?
Pretty chilly. I went on 2 walks already today. And the first walk I went on, it was like low 30s, and now it's like higher 30s. So got a little sweaty on the second walk in the high 30s,
Well, I think you'd love it here today. It's beautiful. It's sunny, clear. 60s right now. It'll probably warm up to the low 70s today. Pretty
It's funny how
nice.
your body adjusts though, because I walked outside and I just had a beanie, a sweatshirt, and some pants on. Like I wasn't really heavily, clothed. But I'm like, oh, this is nice out. But here in the summer, it's like 110 degrees. It's crazy how quickly your body can adjust to that, though, where I'm like, oh, 36, lovely.
So, what would you wear if it was 36 degrees in San Diego?
Well, so that's the thing. Your body in San Diego never adjusts because the weather's always within, like, say, 20-ish degrees, I think. And so for me, when I lived there, if it went below 60, I wouldn't go outside.
Well, that's the
I was
thing.
just
If it
like,
was
well,
36 degrees outside,
this
it'd be
day's
like,
gone.
it's a
Forget it.
blizzard emergency. I need to stay
Yeah.
home because
Yeah, and it
this
just
is
has to
insane.
do with like you're just adjusted in that way. Like I can't when in your body adjusts quickly and you get there and you're like, "Oh no, I'm not anything below 60, I'm done." And I will say there's something about Southern California cold that's different and it has to do with like the current coming down from Alaska. The water's really cold in the Pacific there. It's not really friendly for swimming in. Most people wear
Right.
wetsuits when they go in the ocean. And there's something about that chill that comes off the ocean that hits a little different.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Well,
we've spent 6.5 minutes not talking about what we're supposed to talk
I
about.
know, but we want to ease into this because we're going to be talking about some really contentious stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, off the bat, I want to say this. It's Black History Month, and I'm going to talk about the distinct culture or cultures that develop amongst African Americans as kind of Black culture. And it's the way many historians who study it kind of refer to it. Neither Hillary and I are 100% specialists in this field, although both of our areas of research are incredibly linked with the history of African Americans, the Black experience in America. True?
Yeah. And I mean, my dissertation was the foundation of my dissertation was that the penitentiary system in the United States, its foundation was the system of slavery. And that was like a highly contentious claim to make. And I got a lot of pushback by a lot of different people who were very uncomfortable making such a broad claim. And like, I think that my work, I can kind of see it how it aligns with the 1619 project, but I can also see how there were issues with it, right? And like, I think we're going to get into a lot of that today, but so much of my work and what I study is that I think slavery is so central to the American story that it's sort of it's kind of in the midst of us at all times, no matter what institution we're building or what we're doing. Although it may not be on everybody's lips where they're talking about slavery, I think the system itself, like the oppressive system of slavery, really kind of underlies so much of American history in our institutions. So I think we differ a little bit on that. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I've been reading a lot of the back and forth between historians because that's something that's important is like not all historians agree, right?
Oh, I mean, particularly how formative the institution of slavery was to an American identity, its relationship with capitalism. When does slavery, as we kind of recognize it in the 19th century, start? All of those things, they are points of contention. And I think we're going to touch on quite a few of those over the next kind of 4 weeks.
Yeah. So,
yeah, go ahead.
well, did you want to start by talking a little bit about the Atlantic slave trade in general, how it starts, what's going on there, or where do you think is the starting point?
I think a good starting place is to make a note that we know the first people who are forcibly brought from Africa to the Americas, specifically to what will be the United States in the future. And it's the basis of the 1619 project. So in 1619, boat arrives and it's carrying these people who have been kind of captured and enslaved. And they're brought to to Virginia, to the Tidewater in Virginia. And the slavery that they enter into, the slavery that they're kind of caught in is very different than the slavery that will exist 100 years later. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Well, a little more than 100 years later.
Yes. And there are a lot of reasons for that, because the slave trade and the way that slaves are treated and captured and brought to the United States or other places in the Americas, right? Like it shifts and changes over time. And at that point, slavery was not racialized. It wasn't a black white binary of everybody who's black is a slave and everybody who's white is not. And that idea actually develops over the course of 100, 200 ish years as we move into the 19th century, where racialized slavery becomes the norm, where we think about it now and we think, well, that was just how it was from the beginning, that it was just this racialized system that, well, you go find people with darker skin. But that's not really the case in 1619, although it very much becomes the case. But what they enter into is very different. Yeah, you're right. There's not these massive plantations. There's not the same types of labor in 1619. There's not as much of an economy in the budding colonies as there is by the 19th century.
So I think we've got kind of two strands here. First, kind of, we need to talk about indentured servitude. But before that, I want to make it clear that the British aren't the first to kind of bring slaves over, even though it's an English vessel that lands these 19 or 20 African individuals near Jamestown, and introduces kind of slavery to the British colonies. The Portuguese and the Spanish have been doing it for a little while.
Right. And the other thing, though, that's important is, like, there had been Black people or people of African descent who had been in North America prior to this arrival of the slave ships. For example, there were people of African descent who were on Spanish and Portuguese slave ships who explored parts of the now current American Southwest.
Estavanico.
Yeah, that's right. And so in the 16th century, right, we had, it's not like the very first African arrives in 1619. It's that the first group of Africans who are enslaved arrive at that time in what is now the United States. But you're right. There had been slave trading had been happening, way prior to the United States' involvement in the slave trade. And then before that, the British colonies' involvement in the slave trade. What I get a little concerned about, though, when people will say things like that, I think we'll circle back to this several times, but I'll have students a lot of times say things like, well, the United States wasn't the only one who did slavery.
True,
right? There seems to be like this automatic like defensiveness that like a lot of white people will throw up. Well, only 400,000 slaves came to the United States. 10 million went other places. Like, there's like, they will come across these figures and then just like throw it out you like the United States wasn't that bad because other people were doing it. And it's, yes, other people were doing it. Other countries did participate.
Well,
this was a global trade, but we're not going to use the numbers to be dismissive of the severity of it.
Well, it's more than just numbers. And one of the books I'm going to mention today talks about it. It's about numbers, but it's also more than about numbers. But indentured servitude, I mean, here's the thing. So we've got this indentured servitude, and life in these colonies across the Americas is incredibly hard. Jamestown, they have real trouble attracting laborers because it's hard work. And the mortality rate's like super high. So in 1619, this Portuguese slave ship is captured, and these 19 or 20, and I keep saying that because there's a little ambiguity whether it was 19 or 20 people, are kind of captured, and then they're brought into Jamestown. And it's assumed they're kind of put to work under indentured servitude contracts, because we know in 1640, we've got an African, so somebody who was actually born in Africa, an African who actually gets sentenced to life in servitude because he tried to escape his indentured servitude contract. So these contracts traditionally had been used to help kind of poor people in England pay their passage over the Atlantic. They would promise to serve a number of years. But a lot of these contracts were very complicated and included provisions that if you tried to escape your contract, it would extend the length of it. If you broke the law or you did something that the contract owner did not like, it would extend the contract. If you're a woman and you became pregnant, you would extend the contract. I mean, all these laws. And this
If you
man,
were a
John.
woman and got married, your contract
Mhm.
ended.
Right.
So that was what we talked about in a few episodes ago. Is like there was a incentive to get married very young if you were an indentured servant, right?
Uh-huh. Well, here's the thing. I mean, this man who escapes, who tries to escape in 1640, John Punch, he escapes with two other white men who were also under indentured servitude contracts. He's sentenced to life in servitude because of it. The two people he tried to escape with were only given an additional year on their contracts, as well as 3 years that they would have to serve the colony. This is a pretty important moment, this point in 1640, because it is making a racial distinction between a black man and two white men.
Well, and at this point in time, it's also important to mention that there is a clear distinction between indentured servitude and slavery, and people are well aware of that distinction.
Well, slavery existed, and they knew about something called slavery. And I think the English were very proud that they didn't do that they had this indentured servitude thing.
Right. It was like, so what's interesting is that they do know that it exists. And in the 17th century, there would be people, complaining about indentured servitude and saying, we're being treated like slaves. They know what slavery is. They don't think it's wrong. They just don't want to be a part of it.
Right.
They know that it exists. They know that some people are enslaved and they think that they're above that. And that starts to become racialized. White people who are in indentured servitude start complaining about their status. And you start to see a huge decline in the number of indentured servants who are coming to the colonies in the late 17th century and certainly by the early 18th century, because they know now, wow, life over there is really hard. You know, they kind of figure out that it's not so great over there, and you have people complaining about their status. And to me, that just is indicative of the fact that they know that slavery is a thing and they don't want to be treated as such, or they feel somehow superior in their station in life that they should not be treated as slaves. And of course, nobody should be treated as slaves, right? But in this moment, there's this distinction that arises and it becomes racialized by the mid 16th century? You kind of say 1640.
I mean, 1640 seems to be a date, but so you've got kind of that moment of John Punch, but I want to talk about a man I brought up last week or the week before, I forget which, Antony Johnson, because he's a fascinating guy. Evidently, some people who oppose the Black Lives Matter movement are now using him as fodder to make a really problematic argument. They're basically arguing that Antony Johnson found slavery in America.
Oh, can you elaborate? I'm unfamiliar with this.
Yes.
There's no one person.
Well,
let's just say there's no one person
yes.
who found slavery.
Yeah.
I will say that.
Researching this week, I found out about this, and I had done a lot of reading about Antony Johnson. There's a great book. This is the first of several books I'm going to mention today. There's a great book that was published some time ago called Mine Own Ground. This is by T.H. Breen and Stephen Ennis. And it kind of traces Johnson's history. And what's interesting with Johnson is this: in 1620 or 1621, he is brought over from Angola as an indentured servant. I mean, it's a slave, but it's an indentured servant in that there's an expiration date to his servitude. There is a point after which he will no longer be a slave. And he's brought over and to the Tidewater, to Virginia, because they're just really struggling to get employed, kind of get people to work. And he works growing tobacco, basically. Everybody who's brought over there to work is kind of fueling this tobacco industry. And he gets over there and he does fairly well and is able to save some money and eventually gains his freedom. And here's where people who are opposed to Black Lives Matter start to change this narrative. So Johnson ends up with his own indentured servants. And at least one of these indentured servants is a Black man. And that person attempts to escape. And his name was John Casor. And he tried to escape. And this is 1654. So after that 1640 kind of distinction of punishment for white men versus Black men, he tries to escape, and actually he's kind of determined to not be legally allowed to do that. And what the right, some people on the right who are kind of trying to portray him as the founder of slavery, arguing is that he brings this case against Casor, and we have the legal enshrining of slavery. Does Antony Johnson have a slave at that point? Yes. Does Antony Johnson found slavery in America? No, because other people are doing it at the same time. Antony Johnson just happens to be one of the first cases we have in kind of legal records. But it's kind of a gotcha, right? I mean, that's why they're pointing it out.
I mean, the idea that anybody invents slavery is just so silly to me because, again, I hear students make this argument all the time in order to minimize, the United States' history enslaving people, to say, well, slavery's always existed. Well, yeah, we do know that. And that's not to minimize it. It's to say, yes, it's been a horror of human nature from as far back as we can tell, right? And so to even try to make a claim that there was one person who invented this horrific concept and kind of just this like thing that humans have done for a very long time, to say that one person did it is absurd. And it's easy. It's too easy to just say, well, this one person is responsible for all society's evils. It's just kind of silly. And why are you said this is like a political thing, like conservatives want to point to one person. Why would that be the case? Can you elaborate?
Well, I think it's a gotcha they see it as a gotcha for the Black Lives Matter movement. They're like, oh yeah, well, Black people were the ones who originally enslaved other Black people in the United States.
Oh my God. I hate that argument too. I've also had students, and I keep saying this, I have students who do this or that. It's not to say something bad about them, but I have students who will come to me to defend the United States. And they'll say things like, well, it was African people who sold other Africans, almost to dismiss or say that it was okay, that slavery was okay because, well, they were sold by other Black people. So how is it racist? And that kind of argument is just so troubling and belittling to, I think, the overall suffering of people. And I also think it's wrong because to me, there's no excuse to say, well, the Spanish did it. Well, the Portuguese did it. Well, they sold them. It's like all of these humans were involved in this really crappy, awful, torturous, barbaric practice, and they were all benefiting from it financially, economically, right? And then eventually it becomes a cemented, racialized practice, whereas it may not have been initially. It becomes pretty firmly cemented, racialized by the mid-17th century. And so this is what the 1619 Project is arguing, I think, is that, this kind of underpins or kind of is so important to look back at this moment in the 17th century to say this is a really intricate portion of American history, even though the United States has not gained its independence yet. We can't ignore this important moment in the mid-17th century where slavery and enslavement does become racialized and it becomes black versus white.
Well, and it points, I mean, this is again going back to this book, Mine Own Ground. I think what's really interesting is this period, the 1640s to the 1650s, is really this moment of flux because the Jamestown colony is now turning prosperous. I mean, Johnson benefits from that prosperity, ends up accumulating about 250 acres of land and enough resources that he needs his own servants, indentured servants, and eventually something that becomes someone who becomes a slave. And there's this great quote that they include. I'm going to read it really quickly because I think it like crystallizes Johnson, what it was like for somebody like Johnson at this moment. So Johnson displayed different social personalities within different contexts. Sometimes class consideration defined human relations. Sometimes race was the major factor. What we today label identity was in fact a fluid set of possibilities. For as Johnson and the other free blacks understood, legal exchanges were with members of the white planter elite demanded forms of social and culture quite different in character from those assumed in conversations with poor white neighbors or with other free Africans. It is not that Johnson did not possess a core identity. The problem is that from the fragmentary records with which historians must work, it is impossible to say with certainty whether he was being more authentic in one sphere of his activities than the other. More true to an imagined self when he sued a white planter in the county court, purchased an African slave, or sold a horse to another free black. Like other people living in his society, Johnson learned to interpret situations, negotiate opportunities, and calculate contingencies. And I think that I love that because it's like at the end of the day, Johnson is an individual. And sometimes he acted in ways that seem inconsistent to our modern sensibilities.
He acted out of his own self-interest. And to somehow
Right.
suggest that people only act out of self-interest if they belong to a certain race is preposterous.
So we've got that situation, and then we move to what I would argue is kind of the next formative kind of moment, which is Bacon's Rebellion. What do you think about that? Is that
Oh yeah, I have that up right here. We've talked
so?
about this a little bit, but
Yes.
this is Edmund Morgan's argument in American Slavery, American Freedom, which is like this, kind of cornerstone text, I think, in American history, and especially in graduate school. I think everybody's supposed to read it. There's been a lot of pushback to it within the last several decades, but I would say, this text was written in 1975, published in 1975, and Morgan makes this kind of, at the moment, revolutionary argument about how slavery in the colonies is racialized based upon Bacon's Rebellion. I think we've touched on this in other episodes. Is that true?
We talked a little bit about Bacon's Rebellion in our Rebellions episode, but I don't think we delved very deeply into it. And I think it's a fascinating moment because it's just it is a collision between white English colonists, black people, some formerly enslaved, some not, and local indigenous people. And there's this kind of
They all join forces, right?
So here's the thing. It's the English Civil Wars have been going on, and you have to connect this with England, I think, and the political situation in England. But there is a strong class-based discontent in the Virginia colony.
Yes, and people of these lower classes. So like that included everybody of all colors, races, ethnicities, religions, right? There are people who are of a lower class that kind of span the gambit of the color spectrum in the colonies.
Mm-hmm.
We have indigenous people. We have, black people who were free or enslaved or indentured, and white people who are of a lower class. And they all kind of pull together and say, hey, we're all kind of put into this class. Let's rebel, right? Like we can as a mass take down this larger power. And it's at this moment that the British, right, and like the powers that be are like, oh shoot, we can't have all these low class people being friendly and fighting against us. We've got to divide them. And what best way to divide them than to point out their differences with one another and to create a caste system, basically, amongst these individuals?
Well, so the governor of Virginia, what he does, what I find so interesting is this on one level is about land, and the Virginia governor kind of declares war against who he considers bad Indians, um, and he starts kind of raising forces to go after and kind of kick people off, kick these bad Indians off their land and take their land. At the same time, you've got kind of lower class people, kind of people who are struggling, like Bacon, um, who feel they are not being provided opportunities to expand financially in the colony, and that the elites keep benefiting from these rulings, including this Berkeley. Berkeley's the governor, including Berkeley's kind of announcement that they're going to go after these bad Indians. Um, Nathaniel Bacon actually petitions Berkeley and says, make me a general or put me in charge of a militia group and I can go do this. And he's told no. And to him, that is evidence that that the elites are maintaining their stranglehold on property in the colony. So Bacon declares himself general of a local volunteer group of Indian fighters. And they start fighting these Indians. And Berkeley doesn't like it. Eventually, the confrontation between Bacon and the Pamunkeys, which is a tribe that's kind of on the land that Bacon targets first. Berkeley has some forces that show up there, and there's kind of this confrontation between the two. And what's interesting is Berkeley is really trying to use kind of new political sensibility because he pardons everybody in Bacon's army if they go home immediately, but he also declares Bacon a rebel, and he's an open rebellion. And this goes on. I mean, I'm not going to get too much further into the details of this, but it is a political thing, and it quickly incorporates class as well. And kind of the end goal of it, or the end result of it, is to kind of heal the class wounds in the colony, in the Virginia colony, that are so laid open during this rebellion between elites and poor white people, particularly. Racial lines are solidified, and former slaves who are now free black people, that increasingly becomes an impossibility to even imagine. Slavery is tied with slavery is tied with being black. Indentured servitude is disappears basically. And there's this kind of racial unity, or a myth of racial unity, that's created for white English people in the colony.
Well, I think it's important to highlight, though, just how formidable Bacon's forces were in disrupting life, right? I mean, you said, we don't want to get too far into Bacon's rebellion. I mean, we could do a whole episode, I guess, but the point is, they have about 500 men, and they're just outnumbering Berkeley and Berkeley's troops, and they end up burning down the capital, the colonial capital, right?
Yeah.
That's a formidable force of people who have come together, who are all from this lower class, and they freak the elite people out and oh my gosh, we've got to divide these peons immediately. And we see that to this day, where poor white people and poor black people would be best off uniting forces because of the similar needs that they each have. But racism for centuries has divided people.
Mm-hmm.
All poor people together should band together, right? Or anybody making $100,000 a year should band together, and we could topple the system. But because of all these different these different walls that have been kind of thrown up as, well, you're different than this person and that person, and it all, all these differences get highlighted, and everybody's too busy squabbling on the ground over things. And then, people are making millions of dollars up ahead and like laughing at all of us.
Well, I mean, what I see is this, is that there's a possibility, there's a moment here where Bacon, as he gathers forces, and those forces become increasingly diverse, and he seems to be clamoring for a wholesale change in the way the colony is organized to heal that after Bacon's dead. And Bacon does not die in the Bacon's rebellion. Bacon actually dies of body lice, which is
that sentence
weird.
is really funny. Bacon dies of body lice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His death inspired this little ditty. Bacon is dead. I am sorry at my heart that lice and flux should take the hangman's part. So Bacon becomes vilified in popular culture in Virginia after this relatively quickly. And officials in the colony move to grant certain privileges to all white people living in the colonies. To say, here, you're white, therefore you get these rights.
Yeah, and then it immediately divides people.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes even the lowest class, poorest white people feel like they're a part of something, right? Like they're a little bit higher on the rung of the ladder. There's this new book that came out recently about caste in the United States. You know what I'm saying?
What's it called?
It's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents.
Discontent, that was the word they used. Yeah.
And I bought it, and it's really an interesting book because she kind of compares the United States with like a caste system in India.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a little bit, right? But I mean, I would say historians who study the history of India would argue that the British simplify that caste system and misunderstand it. So part of me wants to see is she misusing it, but I think it's an interesting
splash though in 2020, right? It was like Oprah's book club, and it's by Elizabeth Wilkerson. But a lot of people have been talking about it to try to reframe the way we think about the United States. And I think in this context of Bacon's rebellion, it is interesting to think of the United States as a caste system, and not a caste system like India, although we use the word caste to describe what happens in India. But if we think about it in that way, like, it kind of is a different approach, I think, to studying this period of time, even though, like, I mean, you pointed out there's some issues with that, but I think like the wide availability and popularity of this book is going to have a lot of people thinking a little bit differently about this country's history.
Well, so going back to Antony Johnson really quickly, I think what's interesting with him is he dies in 1670, and his widow, almost immediately, larger landholders around Johnson swoop in, and they actually declare that Johnson was never legally allowed to own that land because he was a black man. So you see this even
change quickly, right?
Yeah, this is 6 years before Bacon's rebellion, but there's a change that's happening that's in the air, and Virginia is the epicenter for this in the English colonies. This is the place all of this is kind of being decided. If you go further south, so we traditionally think of South Carolina as, like, of the 13 colonies, the place where slavery is kind of the most solidified, kind of, but it's because South Carolinians, many of them have ties to Barbados, and they bring a Caribbean model of slavery with them, which is different than the one that's kind of emerging in the Tidewater.
And it has to do with the different types of labor available, right? Mm-hmm. The types of labor that need to be done based on region. And a lot of the labor that's done in the Tidewater is vastly different than what ends up happening down in like Mississippi into the 19th century. It's just different, right? And it's different than what's happening in the Caribbean plantations, like with sugar. The need for labor varies wildly.
Yeah, so we've got 1640, we've got some decisions. 1670, Johnson dies. There's a decision that he could never have held land. 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. And then finally, Virginia implements slave codes, like formal slave codes in 1705. So what I find interesting there is it's a roughly 60-year period where we go from a very kind of informal slave system where you've got indentured servitude contracts, and a person doesn't exactly own another person, but a person owns a contract over that other person. To now, by 1705, no, the person actually owns that person.
And to me, what's so important about that language and to lay out why the 1619 project and discussion of the colonies and the North American colonies prior to the establishment of the United States is how central property becomes to American independence. Property is central. And property means owning slaves. They avoid talking about slavery like the plague in a lot of the founding documents, but they do not avoid talking about property. And it is at the forefront.
And everybody knew.
Discussion. And property means owning other people. We can't move away from that. We have to talk about that.
Well, great segue to the next book I wanted to mention, which I love this book, and I tell everybody I know to read this book. So Stephanie Smallwood publishes this book in 2007 called Saltwater Slavery, A Middle Passage to Africa, From Africa to American Diaspora. It is a brilliant book. I love this book. It is so well researched, so thorough in its supporting points of evidence to make this broader argument. And basically what Stephanie Smallwood says is, over the course of the 17th and early 18th century, we get the creation of an Atlantic world economic system.
And the commodification of human beings, right?
Right. So we have the commodification of human beings, just as we are exchanging alcohol, tobacco, gunpowder, cloth, sugar, coffee, chocolate, all of these things that are being traded. Just as we're trading all of these things, we have commodified human beings the same way. And she uses these amazing accounting documents, and she focuses on the marginalia, the notes that are written on the sides of the ledgers. So a lot of these are like ships manifest and ledgers. And her focus is on the Middle Passage itself. The moment a person in Africa sets foot on the ship that's going to take them across the Atlantic, and she calls it a social death. And I love this idea she comes up with, because it's such a heartbreaking recognition of how these people are denied their humanity.
Immediately, because they're commodified as if they're just a good or service being transferred. You're right. It's such a great way to put it.
And it's a social death because these slave traders are very shrewd in how they do this. And what they do is they try not to have a ship loaded with Africans all from the same place. Because if they can put people in a situation where they have no common way to speak to each other, no common cultural references, anything,
no common
there's less likely to be issues.
Language, religion, all of the things that make us human. If you strip people of that and isolate them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, I would argue, and Smallwood does to some point, but she's got kind of a broader argument she's making, but I think she's pointing to, this is the nascence of Black culture in America. This is the formative moment for it, because so many of these people are deprived connections to their culture back in Africa. And they have fragmentary knowledge of this culture. And a lot of these people are very young.
And so then Black culture in America the commonality becomes enslavement. That what they all share in common is that they have been enslaved.
And it's an amalgamated culture, right? It's taking bits and pieces from West Africa, bits and pieces from Angola, bits and pieces from Equatorial Africa, and kind of mixing them together, and you get this new thing. I want to read a quote, and this has to do with the salt water. And this book just has so many more moments of poignancy. Um, what what liquid do humans produce out of their eyes that is salt water, basically tears? And I think she's really kind of linking that, right? That the salt water is this kind of ocean of tears of these people that have been socially killed, socially murdered. Considering the saltwater dimension of slaves' lives allow us to piece together a picture of a place, a time, and an experience that does not otherwise figure in the archival record. Such an analysis of what happened to captive Africans in the Atlantic offers something we cannot get simply by including Africa and our histories of African America, or by singling out African captives as involuntary migrants, or by naming the Atlantic crossing the Middle Passage. Here's a story of American slavery that begins in Africa and the Atlantic, and the saltwater slavery of people's emotion, diaspora shaped by violence encompassing the African, Atlantic, and American arenas of captivity, commodification, and enslavement. I love it.
Yeah, that argument is so important for describing just how dehumanizing slavery was in the Middle Passage. Just like, and the intentionality of it too.
Oh yeah, this is not. Yeah, I mean that's her whole thing. This is strictly a numbers game for the people who are transporting these people across the Atlantic.
And that's what she does
They are.
with these ledgers, right?
Mm-hmm,
Because so many people, so many historians for so many years were not able to really extract a story other than like a quantitative story about, this number came this time, this number came that time.
mm-hmm,
She, in the margins, is able to extract a human story. And the story is how people are stripped of their humanity in these ledgers. And it's
mm-hmm,
really groundbreaking historical inquiry. I think it really changes and shifts the way that historians can approach the archive, because oftentimes so much of our data is this quantitative stuff. And I do that because I think that because I work with prison ledgers a lot, right, where it's just like people are just being written down one by one and counted, and prisoners are counted. But Smallwood's work really brings to the fore that historians can do a lot of work uh, by what's not there just as much as what is there, right? And so she brings forth this really important story about the dehumanizing nature of the slave trade and how intentional it was. And you're right, it's such an important book, I think, for understanding the Middle Passage, and so important for understanding the colonial era of the slave trade. Because something people don't realize is that the importation of slaves is banned in the United States 20 years after its founding. You're not allowed to import slaves anymore on these huge slave ships. So throughout the 19th century, the United States slave population increases naturally, meaning that there are extensive programs in order to make sure that slaves are being bred essentially in order to repopulate the slave population. They're not coming, off the boats from Africa anymore. But Smallwood makes this intentional argument about what slavery is in the Middle Passage in the 18th century and how it's different than what happens in the 19th. But it's the basis for the formation of African or Black culture in the United States, this experience of being stripped of humanity, and that the one commonality is enslavement is the basis for Black culture in America. It's
mm-hmm.
profound.
Well, and she also points to how these people who've been enslaved are being deprived at multiple points, and one of them is they are deprived cultural connections with Africa. But at the same time, at this moment, at the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century, they are also being deprived any ability to kind of establish families and communities of their own. And what she argues then is their only connection then becomes the next ship that's transporting enslaved people. That it's so it reinforces that idea that slavery is the common identity point for what will become Black American culture.
Well, and it's also important, that argument is important and transferable to the times when families are bought and sold, and that families are continually torn apart, right? Even after the experience on the slave ships, people will be transferred from plantation to plantation and owner to owner, and kinship ties are constantly being interrupted. And this happens well into the 19th century.
So, moving forward to the Virginia slave codes, I mentioned them briefly, and I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about them. But I do want to point out what the slave codes in Virginia do. One of the most important things they do is slaves are people who were imported from non-Christian nations. That's how it gets defined. And what that means is the English can't be slaves, the Irish can't be slaves, the French, Germans, none of these people can be slaves. But many West African nations, some of them were Muslim at this time, they could be slaves.
But what's interesting is that in the 19th century, Americans take great pains to convert their slaves to Christianity and use Christianity. Christianity is used both as a tool of anti-slavery and abolition rhetoric, as well as oppression, slavery, patriarchal rhetoric, right? Like it's used both ways, but they go to great pains to convert people to Christianity later on. So where's the shift there?
I'm not sure. Here's the thing. We've got these bookend moments, right? We've got 1705. Things start to change about the 1720s. But not to get too far off the track, the other thing I want to bring up is there is resistance to this growing institution of slavery. And I don't know. I'm thinking about your question. We have to come back to that.
I think it has to do with the Second Great Awakening. And we can talk about that later.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that next week.
It's 19th century, but it has to do with like religious revival, I think.
Right.
And just like
I'm just trying to think if there were, I was just trying to think if there were any antecedents to it, any kind of moment in the early 18th century where...
Well, we weren't overtly religious at that time, and we spent some time talking about that in a past episode. Like the United States and people who lived in the colonies, and then certainly the founders, weren't overtly religious people. There was kind of like this underlying, we're Christian, whatever, but it didn't dominate their life, and it certainly didn't dominate their rhetoric. And that only comes about in the Second Great Awakenings, like 1790 to 1850-ish. And then you have this huge shift. But it's kind of fascinating when you think about it in terms of how we went from like, well, people who are not Christian, those are the people who are enslaved, to, well, we're going to convert our slaves to Christianity. Like it kind of doesn't make sense, but it is a development that happens, right?
Do you know what was the only colony that very soon after its founding explicitly prohibited slavery?
Is it New Jersey?
Nope.
No.
Georgia.
No way. But that didn't stick.
It lasts from 17th. So Georgia's founded in 1733, and it's specifically established to be a haven for kind of poor people and people that are being persecuted. To the south is Spain, and Spain actually offered freedom for people from South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, who could escape into Florida. They would offer them freedom. Georgia also, to the west, there were various Indian tribes who they had contentious relationships with best. And the trustees, when they kind of in 1735 banned slavery in the colony, they don't necessarily do it from an altruistic perspective. They do it because they don't want to worry about slave rebellions, because they've got these other security concerns. However, there are communities in Georgia. There's a Protestant Scottish group that publicly declare their moral position to oppose slavery. And that actually lasts for 15 years. There is no slavery in Georgia for 15 years. But in 1750, as the indentured servitude market in England kind of dries up finally, Georgia authorizes slavery. So an economic driver, simply, right? This is simply an economic decision to re-implement this thing.
Yeah, and I think that that's what I was arguing last week, is that slavery all boils down to economics and about capitalism and profit and about driving production and economic gains. And I think that that's what the underlying controversy is right now, where a lot of people don't want to connect capitalism and slavery, or they don't want to connect these moments as being, because it's not like it's all part of like some big gigantic evil plan, but it is like everybody's looking out for their own economic best interests, and that's what ends up happening. They're like, well, slavery is lucrative, and the moral aspect of it isn't considered when there's money involved. And that's the same way things are right now. I mean, morality is out the window when there are profits involved. The way that we treat workers, the way that people are still enslaved overseas, building all of our crap that we use on a day-to-day basis and wear, and et cetera. There's just no discussion about human life, the sanctity of human life, the preservation or the respect for it when it comes to profits.
Well, and I think what's interesting and important to note at this point too is by the beginning of the 18th century, slavery exists, with the exception of Georgia, until the mid 18th century. Slavery exists throughout the colonies. 42% of New York City households in 1703 had at least one enslaved person. 42%.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
The only city in the colonies that had higher percentage was Charleston, South Carolina. So this was a widespread institution. Now, the percentage of the population that's composed of enslaved peoples does get greater the further south you go. So in the 5 southern colonies, and remember, this is excluding Georgia, up to a certain point, about 31% of the population. Whereas you go to the far New England colonies and it's about 2.7%, and it kind of gradiates between those.
So you have to kind of think about what that means, though, for the population. It's like you don't have to be super wealthy in order to have a slave at that time.
In fact, I think there is an economic imperative in some groups to make sure, particularly after Bacon's Rebellion, as many people as possible can own at least one slave.
To make them feel all a part of the gig, right?
That they're part of it, right?
That's why we all have iPhones now.
Yeah. So I think we can wrap it up here, because I think next time we're going to talk about kind of the new nation being founded and what they struggle with as we kind of move towards an inevitable. And it is, I know we don't like to say things are inevitable in history, but the discussions that go on with the U.S. Constitution, it seems like there is an inevitable conflict that is coming about slavery in the country. I mean, is that too far to say?
You mean in the 18th century that you see well, of course. I mean, and I think, in the founding documents, like all the founders knew, they even said it, like, this is going to be a problem down the road, but we'll leave it to them. We'll leave it to them.
We'll just kick the can
down the road. And they do, and they did. And it's like that can kicked. Oh my, the suffering, the death, the torture, just unimaginable pain that caused.
Mhm.
it blows my mind that they had within their power at that moment to say, you know what, let's stop doing this right now. And they're like, too hard. Let's let somebody else do it. Wow. Very disappointing.
Yes. So next time, I think we're going to talk about the Revolutionary War and kind of the founding documents and slavery and kind of everything leading up to the Civil War. Um, Spoiler alert: many former slaves joined the British during the Revolutionary War.
Yes, and so that's something that I had that tab open too about, yeah, I mean, the British were like, "Hey, if you come fight with us, we'll not enslave you anymore." And
Yep.
so that was really appealing, obviously, and then the colonists were like, "Hey, wait a minute." And then so that's one of the contentions with the 1619 project too, is the idea that um the author of the very first article um for the 1619 project, Hannah Jones, Nicole Hannah Jones is her full name. She argues that the United States is fighting the revolution and trying to break away from Great Britain because they want to retain slavery. And a lot of historians flipped out about this. Like, no, that's not true. But when you see that proclamation, it's Dunmore, right? Who has that proclamation?
Yeah, Dunmore.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Lord Dunmore says, if you come fight for us and, the British, then you can be free. That sets a whole thing aflame within the colonies. And so we can get into that later because we're going to talk post
Hmm.
1776
Hmm.
in our next
Well,
episode.
I think Dunmore, the problem with making, I think she oversteps the argument a little bit because Dunmore, this is 1775, he makes this argument. Um, he had announced his intent at the beginning of 1775, but it's not until November that he actually issues the proclamation. Um, by November of 1775, most of the people who are on board with leaving Great Britain are already on board with it. Like they are, there aren't many more people you convince after that moment. So I think it's a thing of, I mean, I think if Lord Dunmore had done this a couple of years earlier, then maybe you could start to make that argument. It's a hard argument to make because we don't have enough colonists writing in journals like, today I decided to join the rebellion against Great Britain because they've threatened to take my slave away.
Well, and what I think a lot of the historians, like I think it was Gordon Wood, Sean Willents, these were two of the names. I think there was a couple of others on the letter. What they're arguing is that there was not anti-slavery sentiment in Great Britain at this time, as a matter of fact, and that most of the anti-slavery push and sentiment came from the American colonies, and it was later in the 18th century. So
Mm-hmm.
to say that there was like this underlying, like, oh, well, the British were against slavery and the Americans were for it, they're like, there's just no evidence to prove that. But what I would say is, and I think that this is the argument that Hannah Jones should have put forth rather than saying they were fighting to keep slavery, is like the idea, like I mentioned earlier, about property. They were so
Mm-hmm.
concerned about control and retainment of property, and that means slaves. And so while it may not be, they're writing in their journals, today I want to keep slavery, they're really interested in retaining control of and complete domain over their property, which includes humans. So
Yeah.
I think there's something to
Yeah.
be said about that. But we're going over
Great.
now.
Okay. Well, we're done for today. We're gonna talk about the revolution and kind of the aftermath of that, leading through kind of the what we call the antebellum period in U.S. history next time. But yeah, this has been great. I think it's interesting to have these conversations and to kind of trace out some of these lines. Um, yeah.
Who's going to win the Super Bowl today, Jeff?
Totino's pizza rolls.
They're the winner
Uh,
in my book.
I used to be a big football fan. I am not anymore, and it has a lot to do with actually some of the things we're talking about during Black History Month.
I very much agree with you. I used to follow football very
It makes me
closely until I entered graduate school and was like, wow, this is
Mhm.
really screwed up.
I read a couple of things and it really upset me. And
And I'm a fan of the food, not the football. So
yeah.
tortillas
Puppy
keep rolls.
Bowl. I'll be watching Puppy Bowl actually. So anyway, well, until next time, I'm Jeff.
I'm Hillary. Thanks for joining us.